The tension in the royal departure lounge reached a breaking point when Queen Camilla received a secure phone call that would define her reign's approach to historical justice. On the other end of the line was Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, delivering news that would reshape the entire crown jewels controversy. Parliament had voted in an emergency session to establish a comprehensive review commission with unprecedented authority to examine repatriation claims and recommend binding resolutions. The commission would have access to all government archives and the authority to compel testimony from current and former officials. The Queen's decision to take the call privately, stepping away from her security detail and advisors, spoke to the gravity of the moment. Palace sources later described her expression as she listened to the Prime Minister's detailed briefing about the parliamentary vote. The commission would be headed by a panel of international judges and cultural heritage experts, with representation from all countries making repatriation claims. More significantly, the government had agreed to abide by the Commission's recommendations, effectively removing the Crown's traditional discretion over the fate of contested items. Dr. Rajesh Gupta, one of the lead researchers who had discovered the Mumbai documents, received an unexpected call from Buckingham Palace as Queen Camilla remained at the airport. The palace was requesting an immediate meeting to discuss the implications of his findings and explore potential pathways forward. The invitation represented a dramatic departure from the royal family's traditional approach to handling such controversies, suggesting a willingness to engage directly with critics rather than maintaining diplomatic distance. The international reaction to Parliament's decision created immediate consequences for the Queen's planned diplomatic tour. 3 of the scheduled destination countries announced that they would use official meetings with Queen Camilla to formally present their repatriation claims, transforming what had been intended as routine diplomatic visits into high-stakes negotiations about historical justice. The Queen's team worked frantically to understand whether the changed circumstances made the tour viable or whether postponement might be the wiser course. Legal experts around the world began analyzing the unprecedented nature of Parliament's action. Never before had a government voluntarily surrendered its discretion over cultural heritage disputes to an international commission. The decision reflected both the strength of the evidence revealed in the Mumbai documents and the political pressure created by global attention to the controversy. Constitutional scholars debated whether the action represented appropriate democratic oversight or an unwarranted intrusion into royal prerogatives. Queen Camilla's personal response to the parliamentary decision remained private, but palace sources suggested a mixture of relief and apprehension. The Queen had reportedly expressed frustration with the limited options available for addressing legitimate grievances while maintaining traditional royal protocols. The commission structure offered a potential pathway for resolution while removing some of the personal pressure from the royal family to make decisions that would inevitably disappoint some stakeholders. The Mumbai documents continued to generate international attention as translation teams working around the clock revealed additional disturbing details about colonial acquisition practices. Letters from British officials described elaborate deceptions used to justify taking sacred items, including false claims about protective custody and temporary loans that were never intended to be returned. Several documents revealed that colonial administrators had been explicitly warned by local religious leaders about the spiritual and cultural significance of items they were planning to seize. Security assessments for the Queen's travel had become increasingly complex as protests were planned in multiple countries. Intelligence reports indicated that most demonstrations would remain peaceful, but the emotional intensity surrounding the revelations had created unpredictable dynamics. Several royal protection officers privately expressed concern about their ability to guarantee the Queen's safety while allowing her to conduct meaningful diplomatic engagement with critics of the Crown's historical practices. The tourism industry faced immediate practical challenges as the controversy gained international prominence. The Tower of London, where many crown jewels were displayed, experienced unusual visitor patterns as tourists sought to see contested items before potential repatriation. Museum directors around the world reported increased interest in exhibitions addressing colonial history and cultural heritage disputes, suggesting that the controversy had sparked broader public engagement with these complex issues. Religious leaders from affected communities began coordinating international pressure for immediate repatriation of sacred items identified in the Mumbai documents. Several prominent spiritual figures announced plans to petition the new parliamentary commission directly, arguing that the spiritual harm caused by continued possession of sacred objects created moral imperatives that transcended legal procedures. The religious dimension of the controversy added emotional weight that legal and diplomatic processes struggled to address adequately. Queen Camilla's communications team worked to develop statements that acknowledged the seriousness of the revelations while maintaining appropriate constitutional boundaries between the monarchy and parliamentary decisions. The traditional language of royal statements seemed inadequate for addressing evidence of deliberate deception and cultural violations. Palace press officers found themselves navigating unprecedented territory where royal neutrality conflicted with apparent moral clarity about historical wrongs. The international law community prepared for what appeared to be landmark cases that could reshape cultural heritage jurisprudence worldwide. The commission established by Parliament would operate under legal frameworks that had never been tested in such high-profile circumstances. Legal scholars predicted that the precedents established would influence similar disputes around the world, making the crown jewels controversy a test case for post-colonial justice in the 21st century. Financial implications of the Commission's potential recommendations began to concern government officials and palace advisors. Repatriation of major crown jewels pieces could affect tourism revenue, insurance valuations, and London's position as a global center for art and antiquities markets. Economists worked to develop models for assessing the broader financial impact of various repatriation scenarios, while acknowledging that moral considerations might ultimately outweigh economic concerns. Queen Camilla's final decision about whether to proceed with the diplomatic tour reflected the unprecedented nature of the situation. Palace sources indicated that the Queen was determined to engage constructively with the controversy rather than avoiding difficult conversations. However, the changed circumstances meant that every public appearance would be scrutinized for signs of her personal position on repatriation claims and historical responsibility. The Commonwealth nations found themselves at the center of discussions about how to balance historical relationships with contemporary justice concerns. Several countries that had maintained diplomatic silence about crown jewels ownership began issuing statements supporting the Parliamentary Commission's work. The controversy threatened to reshape Commonwealth relationships in ways that extended far beyond the immediate question of artifact repatriation. University students and academic institutions around the world organized symposiums and conferences to examine the broader implications of the Mumbai document revelations. The crown jewels controversy had become a focal point for discussions about decolonization, cultural repatriation, and historical accountability. Educational institutions reported unprecedented student interest in courses addressing colonial history and international law, suggesting that the controversy was inspiring broader engagement with these complex issues. As Queen Camilla stood in the airport departure lounge, surrounded by advisors and security personnel, the full weight of the historical moment seemed to settle on her shoulders. The controversy had evolved from a manageable diplomatic challenge to a defining test of how modern institutions could address historical injustices while maintaining stability and legitimacy. The Queen's next actions would be watched by millions of people around the world and could establish precedents for addressing colonial legacies that extended far beyond the immediate question of crown jewels ownership. The royal aircraft finally received clearance for departure as Queen Camilla made her decision to proceed with a modified version of the diplomatic tour. The trip would now include formal presentations from repatriation claimants and structured discussions about the Commission's work. The Queen's willingness to engage directly with critics represented a significant departure from traditional royal protocol, reflecting both the strength of the evidence revealed in the Mumbai documents and the changed political landscape created by parliamentary action. The crown jewels controversy had fundamentally altered the relationship between the monarchy and its historical legacy. Queen Camilla's response to the crisis would be remembered as either a successful navigation of unprecedented challenges or a missed opportunity to address historical injustices with appropriate moral clarity. as the royal aircraft taxied toward takeoff. The outcome of this defining moment for the modern monarchy remained uncertain, but the Queen's commitment to engaging constructively with legitimate grievances had been clearly established. The international community watched as Queen Camilla's aircraft finally departed, carrying with it the hopes and concerns of millions of people affected by centuries of cultural heritage disputes. The commission established by Parliament would begin its work within weeks, armed with evidence that revealed uncomfortable truths about historical acquisition practices. The crown jewels controversy had become larger than any individual monarch or government, representing a fundamental test of whether modern democratic institutions could acknowledge and address the wrongs committed by their predecessors while building more just relationships for the future. The departure gate buzzed with carefully controlled activity as Queen Camilla's security detail received an urgent communication that would change everything about the planned journey. Chief Protection Officer James Harrison stepped closer to the Queen, his expression grave as he processed information flowing through his encrypted communication device. The message was brief but explosive. Investigators had discovered new documentation regarding the acquisition of 3 major pieces in the crown jewels collection, and the findings contradicted decades of official historical records. The documents, uncovered in a private archive in Mumbai by researchers working on one of the repatriation claims, included detailed correspondence between British colonial administrators and local rulers from the 1840s. The letters revealed coercion tactics and misrepresentation that went far beyond what official British records had ever acknowledged. More damaging still, the documents showed that several pieces now in the Crown collection had been specifically designated as sacred items that were never intended to leave their countries of origin under any circumstances. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the constitutional historian accompanying the royal party, felt her phone vibrate with incoming messages from colleagues around the world. The academic community was already buzzing with preliminary translations of the newly discovered materials. Within hours, the documents would be front-page news across multiple continents, fundamentally altering the legal and moral landscape surrounding the crown jewels controversy. The Queen's diplomatic mission, already complicated, had just become nearly impossible. Queen Camilla maintained her composure as the implications of the discovery became clear. The royal family had always maintained that the crown jewels were acquired through legitimate means, even if those means reflected the different standards and practices of earlier historical periods. The new documents suggested that some acquisitions had been questionable even by the standards of their time, involving deliberate deception and violations of religious and cultural protocols that colonial administrators knew were being broken. The security implications were immediate and serious. Intelligence reports indicated that news of the document discovery was already spreading through activist networks and social media channels. Protests that had been planned as peaceful demonstrations were likely to become much larger and more emotionally charged. Several governments that had previously taken moderate positions on repatriation were expected to issue stronger statements demanding immediate return of specific items. Palace Communications Director Sarah Mitchell found herself managing a crisis that seemed to evolve by the minute. Traditional media outlets were scrambling to verify the new documents while social media exploded with commentary and analysis. The carefully planned messaging strategy for the Queen's diplomatic tour had become obsolete before the royal aircraft had even departed. Emergency conference calls with government officials, legal teams, and international relations experts filled the secure communication channels. The royal aircraft sat on the tarmac as ground crews completed their final safety checks, unaware of the international storm building around their passengers. Captain Robert Thompson, the senior pilot, received updated flight clearances that reflected heightened security concerns at destination airports. Air traffic control systems across 3 countries had been notified of potential protests and security risks that could affect royal travel patterns. Legal experts in London worked frantically to analyze the implications of the newly discovered documents. The materials appeared to be authentic, having been verified by multiple independent historians and forensic document analysts. The correspondence included specific inventories of seized items, detailed descriptions of religious ceremonies that had been disrupted, and frank discussions among British officials about the questionable nature of their acquisition methods. Several passages explicitly acknowledged that certain items were being taken against the expressed wishes of their rightful owners. The Queen's private secretary, Sir Michael Davidson, coordinated with embassy staff at planned destinations to assess whether the diplomatic schedule could proceed as originally intended. Early reports suggested that security concerns were mounting rapidly as news of the document discovery spread. Several planned events faced potential disruption from protesters, while government officials privately expressed concerns about their ability to guarantee the Queen's safety and the success of diplomatic objectives. International law professors began issuing preliminary statements about the potential impact of the new evidence on pending repatriation claims. The documents appeared to strengthen several cases significantly, providing contemporary evidence of questionable acquisition practices that had previously relied on indirect historical analysis. Legal teams representing various claimant countries worked to incorporate the new materials into their arguments, while British government lawyers scrambled to develop responses to what appeared to be damaging revelations. Cultural heritage experts around the world reacted with a mixture of validation and concern as news of the documents spread. Many had long suspected that official acquisition narratives were incomplete, but the new evidence provided specific details that were more troubling than even the harshest critics had alleged. Religious leaders from several affected communities called for immediate repatriation of sacred items, arguing that their continued possession by the British Crown was deeply offensive to millions of believers. Queen Camilla's personal reflection on the controversy had deepened over the preceding weeks, but the new revelations created an entirely different moral landscape. Palace sources suggested that she had been genuinely committed to finding appropriate responses to legitimate repatriation claims, but the evidence of deliberate deception and religious violations made simple diplomatic solutions much more difficult. The Queen found herself at the center of a historical reckoning that extended far beyond her personal involvement or preferences. The tourism industry braced for potential impacts as the controversy gained international attention. London's major museums and historical attractions had already seen changes in visitor patterns as the original jewel controversy developed. The new revelations promised to intensify debates about cultural tourism, historical authenticity, and the ethics of displaying contested artifacts. Tour operators began developing alternative narratives that acknowledged the controversy while attempting to maintain commercial viability. Media coverage evolved rapidly as news organizations worked to verify and contextualize the document discovery. The story had moved beyond traditional royal coverage to encompass international relations, legal analysis, cultural heritage, and historical justice. Television networks canceled regular programming to provide extended coverage of the developments, while newspaper editorial boards wrestled with how to address the complex moral and legal questions raised by the revelations. The Commonwealth nations found themselves in particularly difficult positions as the controversy intensified. Many had maintained diplomatic relationships with Britain that carefully balanced respect for historical ties with acknowledgement of colonial grievances. The new documents made such diplomatic balancing acts much more challenging, as evidence of deliberate deception was harder to diplomatically minimize than simple cultural misunderstanding or different historical standards. University students around the world organized rapid response demonstrations as news of the document discovery spread through social media networks. The crown jewels controversy had already become a focal point for discussions about decolonization and historical justice, but the new evidence provided concrete examples of practices that violated moral standards across cultures and time periods. Student organizations coordinated international protests calling for immediate repatriation of all contested items. The Queen's security team revised threat assessments in real time as intelligence reports painted an increasingly complex picture of international reaction to the revelations. While most protests remained peaceful, the emotional intensity surrounding the controversy had increased significantly. Several extremist groups attempted to capitalize on the growing anger, though security services maintained confidence in their ability to distinguish between legitimate political expression and serious security threats. Financial markets began to react to the potential implications of the strengthened repatriation claims. Insurance companies holding policies on crown jewels collection items requested emergency meetings to discuss potential exposure to claims and lawsuits. The London art market, always sensitive to questions about provenance and ownership, experienced unusual volatility as traders attempted to assess the broader implications for historical artifact markets worldwide. Queen Camilla stood near the aircraft boarding area as her team worked to finalize whether the diplomatic mission could proceed as planned. The discovery of the Mumbai documents had transformed what was already a challenging situation into something approaching a full-scale international incident. The Queen's personal commitment to addressing the controversy fairly had not changed, but the options for achieving diplomatic solutions had narrowed considerably with the revelation of deliberate historical deceptions. Religious communities that had been mentioned specifically in the newly discovered documents issued statements calling for immediate return of sacred items that had been taken under false pretenses. Several religious leaders announced plans to travel to London to personally petition the Queen for repatriation, adding another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. The spiritual significance of certain contested items had always been acknowledged, but the evidence of deliberate violations of religious protocols created much more urgent moral imperatives. The international legal community prepared for what appeared to be a fundamental shift in cultural heritage law. The Mumbai documents provided the kind of contemporary evidence that had been missing from many historical repatriation claims. Legal scholars predicted that the revelations would strengthen similar claims around the world, potentially affecting thousands of artifacts in museums and private collections. The crown jewels controversy was becoming a test case for how modern legal systems would address historical cultural heritage disputes. As Queen Camilla prepared for what had become an uncertain departure, the weight of historical responsibility seemed to rest heavily on her shoulders. The controversy had evolved from a manageable diplomatic challenge to an international crisis that tested the very foundations of how modern societies addressed historical injustices. The Queen's next actions would be scrutinized by millions of people around the world, making every decision a potential precedent for how cultural heritage disputes might be resolved in the 21st century. The royal aircraft remained on the tarmac as final decisions were made about whether the diplomatic mission could achieve its objectives in the changed circumstances. The Queen's commitment to addressing the controversy fairly had not wavered, but the revelation of deliberate historical deceptions had created new moral and legal obligations that would require careful consideration. The jewel controversy was no longer simply about returning historical artifacts. It had become a test of whether modern institutions could acknowledge and address historical wrongs committed by their predecessors. The morning air at Heathrow Airport crackled with unusual tension as security personnel moved with deliberate precision through Terminal 5. It was supposed to be a routine departure for the royal family, but nothing about this day would prove routine. Queen Camilla stood near the private royal lounge, her normally composed demeanor showing the first cracks of what would become an international incident. The controversy had been building for weeks, though few outside the inner circles of Buckingham Palace understood its true scope. At its center lay a collection of precious jewels that had sparked heated debates about ownership, colonial history, and the very nature of the British monarchy's relationship with its former empire. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, along with several other contested gems, had become symbols of a much larger conversation about repatriation and historical justice. Security cameras captured every moment as Queen Camilla's personal protection officers conducted their standard sweep of the departure area. The Queen herself appeared unusually fidgety, her gloved hands repeatedly adjusting the clasp of her handbag. Those who knew her well recognized the signs of stress that she typically managed to conceal behind years of royal training. Today, however, the weight of the situation seemed to press down on her shoulders like a physical burden. The jewel controversy had erupted 3 months earlier when a consortium of historians and legal experts from India, Pakistan, and Iran had filed formal claims with the International Court of Justice. They argued that numerous pieces in the crown jewels collection had been obtained through questionable means during the colonial period. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, perhaps the most famous of these contested gems, had become the flashpoint for a movement that extended far beyond simple requests for return. Dr. Sarah Matthews, a constitutional law expert who had been quietly advising the royal family, understood better than most how precarious the situation had become. She watched from across the terminal as Queen Camilla's security detail formed their protective formation. The legal challenges were complex, but the public relations nightmare was already spinning out of control. Social media campaigns had gained millions of supporters worldwide, and several Commonwealth nations had begun to formally distance themselves from previous agreements regarding the crown jewels. The Queen's journey that morning was meant to be a diplomatic mission to calm tensions, but intelligence reports suggested that protesters had already begun gathering at her intended destinations. The Royal Protection Team had spent weeks planning alternative routes and backup locations, but the fundamental problem remained unchanged. The jewels themselves had become too controversial to ignore, yet too valuable and historically significant to simply surrender without extensive legal review. Airport staff moved with practiced efficiency around the royal party, but keen observers could detect an undercurrent of nervous energy. The usual cheerful banter between security personnel was notably absent. Even the most experienced royal protection officers seemed aware that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Never before had a reigning monarch faced such organized, international pressure regarding the crown jewels while attempting to conduct routine state business. The media had caught wind of the departure, though they remained at a respectful distance in accordance with long-standing agreements about royal travel coverage. Television crews from around the world had positioned themselves strategically, hoping to capture any sign of the mounting pressure that palace sources insisted was affecting the entire royal family. The Queen's public schedule had been adjusted multiple times in recent weeks, leading to speculation about the true extent of the crisis. Behind the scenes, legal teams representing multiple governments had been working around the clock to understand the potential implications of the various claims. The British government found itself in an awkward position, officially supporting the monarchy while privately acknowledging that some of the historical acquisition methods were indeed questionable by modern standards. Prime Minister's questions in Parliament had become increasingly uncomfortable affairs, with opposition parties demanding transparency about the government's position on repatriation. Queen Camilla's personal involvement in the controversy had begun innocently enough. During a state dinner 3 months earlier, she had worn a tiara containing several of the disputed gems, unaware that her choice of jewelry would be analyzed frame by activist groups around the world. The images had gone viral within hours, accompanied by detailed historical accounts of how each stone had come into British possession. The Queen's private secretary had described it as a perfect storm of historical awareness and modern social media activism. The technical aspects of the legal challenges were staggering in their complexity. Each contested jewel had a different historical path to the crown collection, involving treaties, purchases, gifts, and, in some cases, straightforward conquest. Legal experts on all sides acknowledged that applying modern international law to historical acquisitions created unprecedented questions about sovereignty, compensation, and cultural heritage. The cases promised to drag on for years, but the court of public opinion was moving much more quickly. International relations had begun to strain under the weight of the controversy. Several former colonies had formally requested the return of specific items, while others had taken more moderate positions calling for shared custody or museum loans. The Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, scheduled for later that year, was already being overshadowed by questions about how the jewel dispute would be addressed. Diplomatic cables obtained through Freedom of Information requests showed increasing concern among British ambassadors about anti-monarchist sentiment in their assigned countries. The Queen's security detail maintained their professional composure, but the unusual circumstances required constant adaptation. Threat assessments had been revised multiple times as the controversy gained international attention. Intelligence services reported increased chatter from activist groups, though most remained committed to peaceful protest. The challenge lay in distinguishing between legitimate political expression and more serious security concerns in an environment where emotions ran particularly high. Financial implications lurked beneath every discussion about potential repatriation. Insurance companies had begun demanding new appraisals of the crown jewels, while economists attempted to calculate the monetary value of items that had never been intended for sale. The tourism board worried about the impact on visitor numbers if the most famous pieces were removed from public display. London's position as a global financial center for art and antiquities markets could be affected if the legal precedents established new standards for historical ownership claims. Queen Camilla's personal feelings about the controversy remained largely private, but those close to her reported a genuine struggle with the competing demands of tradition and justice. She had privately commissioned her own research into the historical acquisition of specific pieces, seeking to understand the full context of the claims being made against the crown. Her conversations with historians and cultural experts had reportedly left her deeply conflicted about the appropriate response to legitimate grievances from former colonial territories. The royal family's communication strategy had evolved rapidly as the situation developed. Traditional approaches to managing royal controversies seemed inadequate for addressing claims that touched on centuries of imperial history. Palace press officers found themselves fielding questions that required expertise in international law, colonial history, and cultural repatriation policies. The usual diplomatic language of royal statements seemed insufficient for addressing the passionate arguments being made on all sides of the debate. Educational institutions around the world had begun incorporating the crown jewels controversy into their curricula, using it as a case study for discussions about historical justice and cultural heritage. University students organized symposiums and debates, while scholars published papers analyzing the legal and ethical dimensions of the claims. The controversy had transcended its immediate political context to become a broader examination of how modern societies should address historical injustices. As Queen Camilla stood in the airport that morning, the weight of history seemed to press down on the entire terminal. Security personnel checked and rechecked their procedures, while palace staff made final adjustments to travel arrangements that had been modified dozens of times over the preceding weeks. The Queen herself appeared to steel herself for what lay ahead, knowing that her next public appearances would be scrutinized with unprecedented intensity. The controversy had already changed the monarchy in ways that would only become clear with time. Public polling showed shifting attitudes toward the royal family, particularly among younger generations who viewed the jewel claims through the lens of contemporary social justice movements. The Queen's approval ratings had begun to fluctuate based on her perceived response to the repatriation demands, creating a new dynamic in royal public relations. Airport security systems hummed with activity as additional protocols went into effect for the royal departure. The specialized equipment required for royal travel had been supplemented with enhanced communication systems designed to keep pace with rapidly developing situations. Even experienced royal protection officers acknowledged that they were operating in uncharted territory, where traditional security concerns merged with complex political and cultural sensitivities. The international legal community watched with fascination as the various claims wound their way through different court systems. Precedents established by the crown jewels cases could affect museums, private collectors, and governments around the world. Legal scholars predicted that the outcomes would influence international cultural heritage law for generations to come, making Queen Camilla an unwitting participant in reshaping how the global community addressed historical acquisition disputes. As departure time approached, the tension in the terminal became almost palpable. Queen Camilla's normally steady public persona showed subtle signs of strain that royal watchers would analyze endlessly in the days to come. The jewel controversy had evolved beyond a simple repatriation request to become a defining moment for the modern monarchy, testing its ability to navigate contemporary expectations about justice, accountability, and cultural respect while maintaining its historical identity and constitutional role.